The subject of the second session is trends of residential segregation or integration as a function of students' socioeconomic status and differences of opportunities. And Professor Audrey Addi-Raccah is going to present to us her paper, and Maya Hoshan is going to be the panelist. And I hope that we leave enough time for questions and answers to whomever is interested in it. So, Audrey, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the initiative and all the team that participated in this one of a lifetime experience. Well, we are going to speak, as Noah has said, the trends in residential segregation or integration as a function of students' in socioeconomic status. And my partners were Dr. Yael Greenstein and Hannah Barak. We actually dealt with the attempt at connecting between education and geographical spaces, especially residential areas, such as said communities or neighborhoods, and what is happening in these places vis-a-vis different educational opportunities for the students. There are 5 parts to our review. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'll mention in bullets some of them, but I will focus mainly more widely on what is happening in Israel. Um, the aspect of segregation, the issue of segregation according residential place, is treated a lot today in researchers. If we Google up segregation and neighborhood and localities, etc., we are going to find that we have a lot of papers on this subject from all over the world and quite updated studies. We also find that there are processes of segregation and processes of polarization or separatism of subgroups of the population according to the residential places. It can be according to race, ethnicity, income, and status, and sometimes an overlapping of those criteria. And we can see that in the United States, for example, the studies show, and also in Europe, that there is a strengthening of this segregation. In the United States, the segregation is has a class element. In Europe, there is a class element, but less so, as it's more an ethnic focus in Europe, and today Europe has to cope with these problems. There are different explanations for the segregation. Many of them have to do with economic processes, such as changes in the cost of residential solutions, which brings about mobility of the population, globalization processes, namely ethnic groups that move from one place to another, segregation and marginalization or exclusion of different sectors of the population, and sometimes they decide to do it on their own. They prefer to live with people who are like them, groups that are like them, and in this way these segregation processes are being strengthened. But this process has its ramifications in terms of of opportunities, educational opportunities, and general opportunities as well. And the reason for it is that the residential place where people grow up has an effect on their chances in life and on every day they're going to do, their health, the health services that they get, the occupational opportunities open to them, their education, exposure to crime, etc., etc. So there is almost no element in the individual's life, in an individual's life, where the neighborhood does not affect his or her lifestyle. So it also has an indirect effect on the education system because of the overlapping between the residential place and the school. Most students that come to school represent the population near the school, and that's why at the end of the day what's happening in the neighborhood is a reflection of what is happening inside the school. And the segregation processes in the residential place that have ramifications on the segregation in school, have repercussions on inequality, because we know that in more substantiated places, more affluent places, give to the inhabitants and to the children especially more opportunities than other places that are more that are weaker. And that is why we find a connection between the socioeconomic situation of the neighborhood and different outputs or different properties of that neighborhood, as I've said before, such as crime, the health situation, and the level of education. The attempt at coping with this problem, since there are segregation processes that that increase in the world, we found in the literature two different patterns of coping. One pattern is to reduce the segregation itself, to bring about a situation in which the polarization that exists between the rich and the poor, for example, is going to be smaller by mobility or mobilization of different of less affluent populations to more affluent areas. On the other hand, there is also an attempt to cope with the negative ramifications of segregation by that you don't necessarily change the demographic composition of the neighborhood, but rather improve it. And the studies of intervention programs like this show that you need a lot of investment and also cooperation between all stakeholders in the area in order to promote and advance this idea. And it's also a long range investment, and we have to take that into account as well. And talking after this short introduction to the case of Israel, we can say that in Israel there are processes of segregation. The society is heterogeneous on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is a segregation according to nationality, the difference between Jewish and Arab communities, also differentiation according to religion, neighborhoods with a high concentration of ultra-Orthodox, and there's also segregation or layering according to a socioeconomic status, poor neighborhoods and affluent neighborhoods. And the study, the most updated study, is relatively narrow and limited, and it is divided into two different types. One looks at what has happened in communities in Israel. There is only a small number of studies, but they show that there is an increasing trend of segregation of this type. And there are the other streams of education that focus on segregation, but in the education system, they don't necessarily relate to the specific community or the neighborhood in which the school is located. And maybe there's one or two studies that have tried to combine those two dimensions, and they show, for example, that where there is a choice of schools, there's also polarization within the neighborhoods or between the neighborhoods, or that parents that wanted to improve the quality of education and went to live and went to another school actually raised the prices of houses in those neighborhoods. So this is what we find about the Israeli case. However, the segregation and integration and is an issue that concerns the education system in the past more than in the present. Today it's marginalized in the debate of this issue. And I'm saying that it's marginalized because we know that when we talk with educationists, we know that they are concerned by that. If we are talking about the opening up of registration areas, we think how to do it without increasing the segregation between the different schools. However, we have to understand that the debate about segregation or integration is something that is created that was created right after the establishment of the state of Israel, and when the reform and integration was attempted. But as I've said, the transition and the social change in the Israeli society, the ideological change from a more socialistic society to a neoliberal one, leads to a different social and educational discourse, which deals with the decentralization of authority and giving more voice to the citizens to choose their services, among other things, children choosing schools where children that are similar to their children study. This process, as we've heard also in the fascinating lecture by Noah, is it's accompanied by an increase of the economic inequality. We can see that this process on the macro level happens on the macro level, not only inside the education system, and the social gaps are increased. So we had to decide, and there was an initiative to take this path to try to bring something or to say something concerning segregation processes in the education system when we combine the geographical aspect and the educational one. And we took this initiative to make some preliminary statistical calculations in order to describe the phenomenon, to see if it's really if it really happens in Israel. And um, formed we formed some questions. First of all, is there segregation, and to what extent, if there's been a change in the segregation over time? And the second dimension that interested us was, okay, if there is segregation, how is it expressed? What's the social context in which students study? Because you can have a situation of non-segregation where all the children in the town would have the same composition of children in the schools, but the whole community itself is weakened. So a priori, the social context is for these children is a poor one. But if we take a strong homogeneous schools, all schools can be similar to each other, but the social context in which each one of the students study is going to be considered more richer and more affluent. So it would be a good idea to look at these two dimensions. And another question was if there is a connection between the social context that the students are subjugated to, if this has any connection to academic achievements according to the percentage of the people eligible for matriculation. There are different trends, and we also check the type of matriculation certificate. I'm not going to go into details about that point, I'm just mentioning it. So what we have used were data given to us by the Ministry of Education, information about the students, about the different communities where they study, different publications of the Central Bureau of Statistics, and 2 points in time between 2002. This is the first point in time on which we have information from the ministry, and 2012. This is where we had more information from the database. We dealt with 48 different towns and municipalities in Israel. We had information about 10,000 students, so you can identify the name of the local municipality and its characteristics. All in all, more than 60% of the students study there.
I want to emphasize the discussion that we focused on communities that are large, that have a certain extent of heterogeneity, and various processes can take place in small, homogeneous communities, and this needs further examination. Our entire discussion on segregation, in its first phase, when we discuss it about the education system, requires that we look at these processes as compared to the sectorialization processes that are taking place in the education system. In the Israeli education system, there is already a structured segregation, and that is the sectorialization. There is the secular, the religious, the ultra-Orthodox, and the Arab sectors, and there are different distinctions within them as well, but for our review we did not look into these distinctions. In the report here and there we do emphasize various distinctions, but right now we'll talk about these four streams. And why is this distinction important? Aside from the vast knowledge we have about the processes taking place in each sector, in terms of the communities or the link between the sector and the socio-economic status of the community, we get an unequivocal picture. The Arab sector, which is here on the right hand side, most of the students that study in the Arab state sector it is characterized by low socioeconomic clusters, whereas the Hebrew state, the secular, so to speak, stream, which is on the left, is characterized by a higher percentage of children who come from more affluent communities, where the other two sectors sort of fall in between. The Hebrew state religious sector is more similar to the Hebrew state, the secular, whereas the ultra-Orthodox is more similar to the Arabs. So here we see the distribution of students according to socioeconomic status and the four sectors mentioned. Now, in view of this dependency, it only further strengthened the idea that we need to distinguish between the different sectors when we come to review this topic. And the first question we asked was, is there segregation? Are the schools different from one another in terms of their socioeconomic status? And when we look at each sector separately, so we used the segregation index. There are all sorts of different indexes and all sorts of arguments for and against each, but we decided to take the segregation index as our underlying assumption, and we looked at each sector and we looked at the distribution of the children whose parents had more than 15 years of education, which is higher education and upwards. And this index goes from 0 to 1. 0 means no segregation, all schools are similar, each school has the same makeup of parents with the same sort of education, and 1 means the schools are different. Some schools have no parents with higher education, and others have all parents with higher education. So that's the two extremes. I'm sorry, I cannot hear the comments not made into a microphone. And so we're talking about higher education. And so we saw that segregation is highest in the ultra-Orthodox sector, and actually this data is known based on Blas and others studies where we see processes of segregation, and it's the least prominent segregation in state secular education. However, what is interesting is that when you look 10 years down the line in 2012, we see an increase in segregation comparatively in the state secular. There is an increase also in the Arab sector, with some stability and even a decrease in the ultra-Orthodox and state religious sectors. Another thing we can see is that some of the explanations for this segregation emanate from the geographic location of the community where the school is situated, and so there is a link between the school and the community. Part of the segregation has to do with differences between communities, and we also showed this. Students come to school from various socioeconomic based communities, but some of the differences have to do with the differences between the communities themselves, and that is thought-provoking. What is happening in the communities? What kind of policy do they have? How are they allocating their funds, and what can be done about this? So this is one of the aspects that we see an increase ultimately, and we find social segregation between schools with a certain increase in two sectors. And now the question is, what is the meaning of this segregation in terms of the children's opportunities or their experience learning in different frameworks? Has it made their situation better or worse? How does segregation come into play? And in this context, we looked at two contexts. The first is the cluster's socioeconomic status, the cluster where the school is situated, and the second is the education composition of the parents, and we decided to have it in three levels: low, average, and high. So I don't want to make this too difficult for you, but we have 12 situations of various social contexts that children can be studying in. So this graph is not very friendly, and therefore we took of this table the key trends for each sector, and I want to present them to you. In the Arab education sector, the most prominent thing we can say in terms of social context that children study in is the argument that students in the Arab sector today are in more heterogeneous situations than in the past. This process, if for instance in 2002 about 7 or 8% of students studied in heterogeneous frameworks in terms of the parents' education, in 2012 we reached 15-16%. That's the most significant change, in fact. And we can explain this process with an assumption, but one that is it's quite well supported, and that is that the Arab sector in Israel is undergoing changes in terms of the levels of education and being captive within the communities where Arabs live because of the segregation processes that we talked about earlier. The students are in fact enjoying this advantage where there is a more affluent population in the community, and they are able to live in this sort of integration than in the past. In education, in the state secular and state religious education, we see processes that whereby more and more students are studying in more affluent clusters and more affluent schools. The stronger move to strong homogeneous frameworks and leave behind the weaker populations, because the group of the heterogeneous pool of students is becoming smaller, and we see this as part of the process of the increase in inequality in society in general. Among the ultra-Orthodox, we see that there are more students who attend schools that are less affluent and in communities that are relatively weaker. We found in literature various explanations for this, and one of them is the rate of poverty in the ultra-Orthodox sector, and that probably describes or is reflected by this data. And the tendency of the ultra-Orthodox population to live in communities that are of low socioeconomic status. And the last question is the number of children eligible for matriculation certificates. We looked at this from different dimensions, and we took 4 situations. The first situation is students who attend schools that are affluent in affluent neighborhoods, and we see that their achievements are the highest, which is not surprising. We also took students who attend 12th grade students who go to weak schools in affluent neighborhoods. For instance, they live in Tel Aviv, but they attend schools that have a lower sort of index in terms of social aspects and so forth, and we see that their achievements are low in the state secular sector, but are higher in the state religious sector. So the picture is not very clear. It's per sector. Students that attend strong schools in non-affluent communities also have high achievements, but they are lower than their peers in the more affluent communities, but their achievements are still quite remarkable. And students who attend weak schools in weak communities, and there too we also see a difference between the sectors, and here too the picture is not completely clear. So we can't come and say a very general statement um, across the board that going to weaker schools in a weak community will always be bad. What is a strong school? Someone asked. A school defined according to the parents' education. So even in the state secular education, the state secular sector, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but you see here that in the state secular sector, if you study in a less affluent community but a good school, you get better achievements than studying in a weaker school in a more affluent community. So, what do we see here? What can we sum up and say about this issue of segregation? Can I just say two more sentences? The first sentence is that segregation takes place within the sectors, and that should give us hope that we can perhaps lower the barriers, the social barriers between these sectors. And the second thing is that social segregation takes place within the sectors, and therefore we can take care of this. There are hints and indications that we can make steps that will close these gaps, but we need to identify the needs, learn from them, and try to apply them in larger contexts with the support and resources required. That's it.